Welcome to the Alameda County Water District Special Board Meeting of the Board of Directors on October 27th, 2022. Roll call, please.
Director Sethy,
Here.
Akbari,
Here.
Gunther,
Here.
Huang,
Here.
and Weed.
Here. Since we're on a hybrid meeting, if the general manager has a few comments to make.
Sure. Yeah, I can just make some brief remarks about how to participate in our special board meeting this afternoon. First of all, on behalf of the Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome the public's participation in this special meeting of the ACWD Board. My name is Ed Stevenson, and I serve as the district's general manager. Members of the public may participate in this board meeting in person or remotely by either using the Zoom application or by telephone. Any member of the public participating in person may approach the speaker's podium at the appropriate time. For those participating remotely, note that the meeting agenda and all the presentation materials are available on the district's website at acwd.org. You may reference the instructions at the top of the agenda for how to participate using the controls in the Zoom app or your dial pad if participating by telephone audio. This meeting is being recorded and will be made available to the public for future viewing. And that completes my housekeeping remarks.
Thank you. Please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice. This time we have public comments. Is there anyone who wishes to address the board? Related to
You see a hand up, Mr. Kelly.
Yes, Mr. Kelly.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'm just scanning through the slides here, but I'll get to them in a minute. The on the supply side, as far as climate adaptation goes, a lot of these water agencies are going along blindly, taking the Department of Water Resources numbers where they're talking about 55% Table A allocations, and they don't bother to look back at the last 10 years when they've only been getting about 35% Table A allocations. And there's a big difference. That's a 37% drop in water supply, and they're all acting like they're getting shortchanged, that their state isn't giving them the full allocation. Well, you know, and then they blame the fishes in the Delta or whatever. They blame some natural flows. And that's, of course, I don't think they really understand climate change. And then as far as ACWD goes, the aquifer salinity, you know, all those charts from the management of the aquifer over there towards the west side, you know, I'd like to see more thought going into what happens with sea level rise and what is the degradation of the aquifer salinity expected to be. Or can you keep the ocean out of the aquifer? I kind of doubt it, but you know, it'd be nice to have some data. And then more the local storage, you know, and I'm not talking about Los Vaqueros. I'm talking about Del Val. There's a lot of potential there for storage, as I'm sure you've been hearing for many years, and it's still only half full. And then on the demand side, you notice that some of these slides are actually authored by Brown and Caldwell, and Brown and Caldwell doesn't just do ACWD, it does other agencies around here, and they're, you know, they've seen, I see where at the other agencies that they're working with, the politicians and the bureaucrats are going in there and micromanaging water conservation when they see, and they want to spend all their time talking about lawn rebates and customer guidance and pool installations and pool covers and media outreach and public relations, and they have no concept. They also have some of the lowest water rates around, by the way, low prices, and at the same time, so they're talking about how do we put more water into conservation programs such that more conservation will cost the government more money and become some kind of a social welfare program. which is actually the opposite of how most supply and demand works. When things are in short supply, the prices go up, and then the suppliers make more money, is how it usually works. But these people never heard of that. Thanks.
Well, thank you for your comments. Any other
See no
reactions?
other members of the public online, and there are no members of the public in the audience, just
All right, well,
staff.
thank you. We have a water resources planning workshop. It's the first item of business. And so let me turn it over to the general manager for his comments.
Sure. Thank you, President Weed. This is the first in a series of workshops that are planned for this calendar year and next that'll focus on planning for long-term management of the district's water resources in the face of climate change, evolving regulations, declining availability of water supplies, new water supply alternatives, and other factors using an integrated resources planning approach. This workshop will focus specifically on the draft findings of the district's climate adaptation plan. And our next workshop in this series will dive deeper into the scoping of our integrated resources management work. And that workshop is scheduled for November 16th. So with that, I'll turn it over to our Director of Water Resources, Ms. Laura Heides.
Thank you and good afternoon. We're happy to be here today for this first in a series of the water resources planning workshops. I'll note that we've got two main presenters tonight, Mr. Thomas Nizer, our water supply and planning manager, and Tess Sprague from Brown and Caldwell, the climate and resilience lead. You'll hear a little bit more of an intro in a moment, but I also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the number of staff we have here in the audience that are here in support of today's workshop. And I'm just going to go across the room. Michelle Walden, groundwater resources manager, Ava Lazor, one of our hydrogeologists, Stephanie Nevins, water conservation supervisor, Kelsey Oshiro, one of our water resources engineers, Devin Becker, also water resources engineer. And I think we have a couple of staff that have also tuned in online as well. And so many of them are part of the climate team, as you'll hear, but to match the names with the faces, I know it's been a long time since we've all been here together in person. Thought that would be helpful.
And in Ms. Heides's defense, Ms. Walden was Ms. Myers only a few weeks ago.
All right, well, thank you. Next slide, please. So for tonight's workshop, we are going to be providing a short introduction to the 2022-2023 workshop planning, water resources planning workshop series. We'll have a brief update on water resources planning developments. We'll be sharing, and this is the highlight, the draft findings of the climate adaptation plan study. We did have a number of other things that we thought to put on today's agenda, but decided we really wanted to focus in on this. There's a lot to take in. So after that, we'll be covering just sort of a quick next steps. And as Mr. Stevenson mentioned, more to come at the next workshop. Next slide, please. Oh, and this is just a quick reference that we'll be probably using throughout all of our workshops of the many, many acronyms that we have. Not all necessarily used today, but ones that we refer to regularly. I won't go over it in detail. Next slide, please. And Mr. Stevenson mentioned the workshop series and what we're going to be focusing on over these next couple of years. A couple of objectives for this workshop series, which we do envision will go into next year and throughout. We do want to be updating the board on the latest long-term water supply planning activities that have been going on, obtain input on scoping efforts for a 2025 water resources master plan. And that's going to be a key thing we'll be working on in upcoming discussions. And then we're really going to spend a lot of time discussing key issues to inform our 2025 water resources master plan effort. So there's a lot to come, and this is what we have in store from a very high level. And then with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Thomas Nizer to kick off and talk about today's purpose and get us going.
Is this on? Yep. I'm going to choose to use the podium. I apologize, but I find it much easier to make reference to the slide because it's behind me. Thank you, Ms. Heides. As mentioned, today's purpose is to review we're really going to jump into climate change, but we're going to start with just a brief review of where we've been in our planning efforts. Recall, we started some planning workshops in 2019. The board has been evaluating a number of very significant water resources initiatives. And we've been sort of building up to update to our water supply master plan. So we just want to kind of put it all in context of where we are and where we're headed. And then, as mentioned, tonight's focus will be on the draft results of the climate change, which was scoped as part of a critically important.
Mr. Nizer, I think
Sir.
you need to speak more directly into the microphone.
Sure,
And I'm more concerned about the audience that's offline here.
appreciate it. As mentioned, the climate change is a very significant source of uncertainty, as we heard from our caller earlier today. It is a major wild card in influencing our existing water supplies as well as the considerations for the future. And it needs to be addressed in an early stage, which is what we're doing this year. Right. So first wanted to just take the board back to 2018, when the board was working on the strategic management plan for the district, the sort of the 5-year plan to lay out the work priorities for staff. And at that time, there were these major investments that we were considering, still considering, notably Los Vaqueros Reservoir expansion, investments in water reuse, redefining recycled water, as well as partnering. And then Delta Conveyance at the time, there was a big discussion of the then discussion was water fix and whether or not agencies could opt in or opt out. And there were a lot of questions at that time that the board rightfully wanted to have some answers for. So at that time in 2018, staff identified a number of external processes that were going to resolve a significant amount of the uncertainties that would go into planning. And they were coming over the next 5 years. We're still 4 years down the road here. But those major external decision-making were the water fix project, the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, and then the water use efficiency standards, as we refer to as making conservation a California way of life, which establishes efficiency standards for the district customers that we would be expected to achieve. That would drive our conservation program and establish what our baseline demands would be, which is then used to establish how much water do we need? Wet water. So if the board recalls, this useful graphic was developed as part of the strategic plan, and just walking everybody back through this. This was supposed to be 2018, where we were standing at the bottom of this road here and looking at this sort of 5-year stretch to get us into this Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. So what that cloud bank resembles is that uncertainty, and we weren't sure where it would be going and where it would take us. And just to remind everyone and for members of the public, Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan is a process that is establishing flow criteria for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And it will have significant impacts on the amount of water supply that ACWD will have from both State Water Project as well as from San Francisco Public Utility Commission. Together, that's 60% of our water supply. So here's where we are today. We are dead in the middle of that decision. So there's some pros and cons here. We don't have clarity. The ongoing negotiations are happening. We are not privy to full details. They are done in confidentiality. The good news is we have a lot of information on the sort of range of impacts that we're expecting from the Bay Delta plan. So the band of uncertainty and the amount of cutbacks that we can expect has been reduced. So we have a better window into what to expect. As mentioned, the California water fix process has fizzled out in a long series of attempts to find a conveyance solution for the Delta. We are commencing a new process, the DCP, Delta Conveyance Project or Program Project, the DCP. The unfortunate thing is we know these processes from beginning to finish are many years in the making. And so we are still up for a fair amount of uncertainty. The good news is that, as this board is aware, we see the significance of water fix to be one of resilience, not so much water supply. We're not anticipating Delta conveyance to improve our water supply, simply to provide resilience that it'll be there, be resilient to climate change and other stressors on the Delta. So the sensitivity there, not quite as great. The other development is that the water use efficiency standards, which Ms. Nevins has been actively engaged on, we feel we have about 70 to 85% certainty on what these numbers look like. Whereas 5 years ago, we had no idea where it was going. Most of the demands that we have, our customer base, landscaping and residential, has been established. So we have a pretty good feel on what we do and don't need to do as far as demand management programming. That's where we are as a present on these major uncertainties. The other significant development that's happened since 2018 is that we've entered a single critical dry year. We're in a multi-year period, but we are in a single critical dry year that rivals what we planned for to occur in a once in 30-year recurrence. We're now seeing it happen twice in 10 years. The growing sentiment is that this is the evidence that climate change is here and now, and it's giving us better clarity on our planning and direction. It's certainly influencing the state level activity. The water plan and directions from the state have been very clear to be pro adaptation for climate change, which is great that we're here tonight talking about it. A few things about this drought dynamic. In 2018 and 19, when we talked with the board about this subject, it was a matter of how do we want to handle the 2013 experience. We've kind of blown the doors off of this discussion completely. Having a second critical drought in this year, we're learning a whole sorts of new things. We're also seeing action from the state. Just a few critical things that I'd like to highlight. Curtailments have brought up, including pre-1914 water rights in this drought. This is the first time in state history that we're experiencing this. And it's further indication that the state is acknowledging that the water resources for the state have been over allocated and is finding ways to rein that back in without opening up all the water rights. So this is a really interesting development that we continue to watch from afar and interpret where it's going to take things. We've had executive orders for the past two droughts now mandating drought time action. This was not something that occurred in 1995. The governor had never declared statewide emergencies and mandated conservation. We've been dealing with understanding how much the state's going to take over in droughts. I do feel somewhat with the updated efficiency standards that we're going to move away from arbitrary, thou shalt conserve 10%, 15%, and we're going to move towards prove you're efficient. If you are, you're going to have one set of standards in the next drought versus someone who can't prove it. So I think this is ultimately a good thing. The other major thing is just operating experience. There's no substitution for experience, as we all know. And being in a drought is the time we get to really test our tools in the toolkit. Working with Department of Water Resources and exercising our semi-tropic banking program and learning how reliable that program really is in these critical droughts was something we did not anticipate in the 1990s or even 10 years ago. We are working with the BOSCA, that's the Bay Area Water Supply Conservation Association, the rural customer, the wholesale customers who purchase water from San Francisco. When we go into droughts, the BOSCA group has to agree to how to share the allocation for wholesale customers. We've been testing the current formula that's there, as well as developing a new formula. Real-time experience is allowing that to proceed with a little bit more grounded planning basis, and that's a positive thing, but there's a lot of challenges here. And last, we've been seeing extreme weather events occur and learning how to operate with those extreme weather events. The consensus is coming more and more that we'll see the same amount of rainfall with climate change. It's just we're going to see more of it occur in smaller windows, and learning how to operate with that gives us the surety that we'll be able to get the water supplies we need in those windows. And this is already featured into some of our fisheries restoration efforts, mind you. As was mentioned at the top of the hour, their ACWD did compile a climate change team. We set that up in 2020. It's a cross-departmental team. We have members from every department in there. It was really formed by state level regulations coming in on different planning processes. We had the SIGMA process and the UWMP. Our financial audits were requiring more discussions of uncertainty of climate change. We're seeing this emerging legislation about handling climate change and being prepared for it. So we thought we better get everybody together on the same page and sing it from the same sheet of music. That team, as mentioned, is a 14-member team, and Michelle Niemeyers, I would say, I apologize for not updating my slide last week. Core members of that team are here tonight, as were mentioned, and a few online. And I do want to call particular attention to Ava Laser and Devin Becker, who have been really instrumental on some of the technical work that you're going to see presented here tonight. But this core group was fundamental in scoping the scope of work for the current CAP study that you're going to see presented here tonight. So with that, we will hand over the presentation, the reins to Brown and Caldwell, Dr. Tess Sprague, who the board met at our introductory meeting. Will overview the results. I'd like to point out seems like a very deep dive tonight. I would rather characterize it as a very shallow dive into a very deep pool. This is just getting the highlight enough to understand the study as it comes out. It's complex matter, and that's why the decision from exec staff was to give the whole evening to this subject matter so we can make sure we have a solid understanding of what it's telling us, because it will be giving us direction for the decades to come. So with that, Tess, if you're online.
I am, yes. Thank you, Thomas. Shall I go ahead and start sharing my screen? Sounds like that may be a yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much. All right, 1 minute here. All right, just checking the visual. Do we have a cover slide here for our climate adaptation plan?
Could we introduce the speaker, please, and a little bit of the background?
I'm afraid, Tess, I don't have your bio in front of me, but Tess Sprague is a subject matter expert on water resources planning and climate change with Brown and Caldwell. She holds a PhD and is also published in the subject of climate change and water resources planning. Tess, anything you'd like to add to that?
I think that's a very concise and nice summary. So I appreciate that, Thomas. And also I just want to take the time to reiterate the appreciation for the team that Thomas, you had mentioned earlier, the staff team, because what we'll see and go through this evening is really a product of a collaborative effort, and we've appreciated the opportunity to work with the team throughout this process. So just add that to that introduction, if I may. All right.
Okay, so Tess, just as a quick heads up, your presentation slides show great on Zoom, but we're kind of configuring our in-room screens to show them clearly for the board and those present. So just be a moment.
No problem.
All right. Looks like you're good to go, Tess. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. So we'll go ahead and launch straight into our climate adaptation plan study findings. We've already had the brief introduction for the presenters, so I'll go ahead and skip past that piece. And we've got sort of a preface here. I think, Thomas had done a good job of bringing the introduction of sort of where we were, how we got to where we are now. A couple of things I may just highlight on this slide is really just a reminder and understanding of sort of the scope of what we're looking here, and really that being a high-level assessment to understand some of our vulnerabilities for the district, climate change, and looking at both inaction and also how can we plan and incorporate adaptation strategies for this. And on the note of adaptation as a focus, looking at that, what this is not. We're not focused on mitigation planning, meaning not greenhouse gas mitigation. That would be a separate kind of an effort. And again, just a nod to the district's climate change adaptation team and appreciation of being able to work with them throughout this process. All right, launching straight into our agenda here, we're going to start off with a reiteration of our objectives. And really that's sort of a recap of what we had visited in the very first workshop back in March. So that'll just be a brief refresher there for consistency. And then we'll take a look at our workshop goals, just 2 of those for today to keep us focused. The bulk of what we'll present today is really on the CAP process and results. And what we mean by that are these 4 pieces, specifically aligning district policy, understanding vulnerability and risk, and then looking at how do we pursue adaptation strategies to address some of those risks. And that last piece here is really looking at how do we develop and think through adaptive pathways. And what we mean by that, we'll get to in more detail closer to the end of the presentation, but that's really taking that above understanding for the previous 3 bullets there and looking at how would we understand over time what we might implement, looking at triggers across changing conditions. So we'll get to that near the end there, and we'll wrap up with some key takeaways and next steps before we get to that board Q&A and public comment. So introduction, quick pieces here. Again, the objectives. So some of these to our board members, and also for some of, actually Kelly, I believe you were in attendance at that. So hopefully this looks familiar as well for members of the public. But we're looking at fostering alignment across planning efforts, and that's more of the internal and external policy review there. And then the next piece is, again, identifying climate risks and vulnerabilities, as well as prioritizing actions, read that as adaptation strategies and what we can identify as ways to try to remedy and reduce that risk. And then the last piece here, communicating findings, which is what we're doing through some of these public workshops, and also looking at opportunities that this study may help inform for the future in terms of further engagement with stakeholders. Now for today, for this evening, 2 workshop goals we're going to concentrate on here. First being providing an overview of our process and results that we've taken to complete this CAP. And then the next is a little more interactive, and that's really discussing some of the highlights, highest areas of risk, and recommendations from this initial study. So launching straight into our process and results, just a brief reminder here, we will have a little divider slide that will let you know when we're on which of these pieces. I will say there is quite a lot of content, as mentioned previously, but we'll use a lot of that as sort of reference and make sure we do an efficient dance over what are some of the key points for each of these slides and communicating the findings of the study. So launching into that first piece, the aligning district policy, we'll go ahead and take a look at a few key areas of the policy we reviewed. And just looking and concentrating your attention at that top left-hand side there, we wanted to first establish an understanding of what does it mean to be climate ready, and thinking about that lens as we look through some of the existing plans and policies for the district. And so our definition here in terms of being climate ready really refers to proactively anticipating, planning for, and overcoming challenges for climate change impacts. And in taking that lens, that understanding, we looked at these sort of 5 areas of work and of planning across the district. And you'll notice that none of these are bigger than the other. There are no necessarily arrows representing one feeding into one another. This is taken to be 5 pieces of a cohesive whole for planning and policy for the district. And so just highlighting some of these key pieces, we'll see a little more detail on the next slide. That really boils down to mission and strategic planning, looking at our urban water management planning and the studies that accompany the UWMP. And then, of course, the emergency management component of that when we're thinking about climate threats and risks and what's already documented. And then groundwater management planning, of course, is a core function and component of the district system. And then the integrated resources planning, IRP, and looking at the initial 1995 study as well as the following reviews. Now, when we look at progress to date, so taking that lens, looking through those policies and plans, there are some ways we can identify how climate risks are already being addressed, and what are some pieces across planning that we can say will be helpful in assisting with moving forward. And one of those pieces is really looking at how we set a direction for high-level policy criteria, and you'll see that sort of as a theme throughout some of these documents. And it may seem like we're spending quite a bit of time looking at more the language, but if I can take the liberty to use this rough quote, I believe this is a Gandhi quote: "Your thoughts become your words, and your words become your actions." This is our thought process leading to changes in words that we assume are going to be influencing and prioritizing some of our actions. So there's some importance here when we're thinking about our criteria, how we're framing this and what we're communicating. And so you'll see for strategic planning, we're communicating climate change as a key uncertainty. Looking at our urban water management planning, there's already a development here of understanding an initial climate risk assessment for water supplies, looking at different factors for adjusting and understanding changes to hydrology, and then again, looking at planning criteria. And then emergency management, we look at our AWEA work, the specific hazards and vulnerabilities identified there. It gives a starting point for understanding existing vulnerabilities in the system, and then also identifies some existing mitigation measures to reduce risk, albeit not necessarily generated solely towards climate change. Groundwater management planning, we'll highlight here, really looking at sustainability efforts since the 70s, and also looking at programs that we can start to think about as translating into climate adaptation strategies that the district is already employing and starting down that path and exhibiting existing adaptive capacity. That last piece with integrated resources planning, again, looking at our policy criteria, evaluating some of those uncertainty scenarios is a great first step. And then, of course, looking at climate change as an opportunity and a challenge with the more recent review is an important piece to identify here. Taking a break from a little more verbiage than less, we're looking at this slide here with some key words that we've taken the liberty of creating a word cloud for, and really this represents some of the criteria that I've mentioned in the past couple slides. And this is to kind of understand if we're looking at the priorities that the district is communicating within criteria across planning and policy, these are some of the criteria that tend to pop up more frequently and also with greater emphasis. And one of the reasons we flashed this on the screen is that we looked within our risk assessment at what are some potential consequence criteria we can understand and develop to look at impacts of climate change across different parts of the system and priorities for the district. So that will come into play a little later on the risk assessment content. So this is a brief wrap up here in terms of our internal alignment. And when we're looking at this, it's really just some themes and patterns, areas for growth. And my apologies, I did not realize my video was not on, so I will turn that on. Really here, not a robot, there we go. So some themes and patterns, areas for growth, and also recommended actions we can pull from this part of the assessment. And really the themes are looking at our criteria and priorities, identifying some of the plans and actions that we honestly can already document as existing adaptation strategies and give credit for that, as well as look at what are some of the potential adaptation strategies that we can think about implementing in the future. So in general, we're seeing informal awareness, inclusion and documentation, the climate risks and impacts, and the areas for growth are really some suggestions, ideas for where can we further elaborate. And those are in the area of equity and environmental stewardship goals, how we might measure success of that in the future, and then applying sort of a general climate readiness definition across our planning efforts. In terms of the recommended actions, more of the what to do in practice here, and looking at internal alignment, really updating some of our criteria, finding priorities, looking at elaborating internal goals for things like understanding more fully what some of the sea level rise impacts may be and seeking partnerships to further that understanding. We'll see that elaborated more as we get to the risk assessment. And then expanding on those original IRP uncertainty scenarios, as well as taking an extra effort to translate what are some of the existing plans, programs that are low to no regret actions. And by that, we are defining those as activities which are typically the low-hanging fruit activities, ones that could be more feasibly or readily implemented, those that may have a lower cost or multiple benefits, and those that, and this is a key piece with the climate change impact understanding, those projects, those actions, plans, programs that would have a benefit regardless of whether or not an extreme event or climate change threat occurs. So just to kind of keep that in mind, and really the goal of looking at this is to consider how the district is moving towards establishing that climate readiness. And when we turn outward to our external alignment opportunities, we're looking at local and regional examples. We'll go ahead and have a slow progression here of some alignment opportunities for cities, other Bay Area agencies, some of the caps that have been developed there. The county as well, looking at some key documents and efforts that we can find for alignment, and then also partnerships. And just highlighting a couple of things here, when we're looking at cities and county, a lot of what we can pull from and find alignment in are some of the climate action planning and updates that start to get more towards adaptation and not as much concentrated in mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, looking at potential opportunities for partnerships and seeking funding across the watershed. And that is applicable for both the cities and county. And then when we're looking at other Bay Area agencies and also partnerships a little more broadly, looking for regional adaptation strategies, projects for that, and also trying to utilize the same regional data. So making sure we have an agreement on the data and metrics that we may be using is a key piece here. Again, for both watershed scale management, more regional impacts and partnerships, as well as shoreline protection. When we look at external alignment opportunities, we've got some state examples here. We'll flash up some of those examples. So we've got just broadly sea level rise, as well as our SIGMA general planning. And then we also have at the state level, quite a number of climate and resilience efforts in terms of what you've heard mentioned before, so the water supply strategy in this current year, as well as some of the previous assessments and direction from the water resilience portfolio, which is also reiterated, and the activities therefrom are reiterated in that water supply strategy as well. So last piece here, and certainly not the least important, is our Delta item. One thing I'll bring here is the Delta adapts, and just paying attention to the development and outcomes from the vulnerability assessment from the Delta adapts group as they move towards developing an adaptation plan and approaches there. That'll be a key item as well. So staying invested in the research planning and policy updates there will be a key piece. And so I'll keep, I know there's a lot of information, we'll keep moving here towards our regulatory uncertainties and related risks. And we are almost to the closure of that first piece, in case folks wonder. General areas for the regulatory uncertainties and related risks that we're looking at as we look at different policy. Again, this sort of falls within that policy assessment. Of course, SIGMA being the key one, the urban water management planning, as well as contract state water, the allocations and contract amendments there. And then the Endangered Species Act, as well as the Delta Water Quality Control Plan, and of course, conservation legislation. And Thomas had introduced a number of these as well. A few that we'll point out is we're looking at changes in terms of approaches that and guidance and the data used from the state level, how that is updated and changed over time. That has the ability to have a number of impacts that you'll see kind of on repeat for some of these in terms of existing planning efforts, and that maybe need for more staff time, changes in approach, using different data, applying new data and models, for example, and then also understanding that some of these key uncertainties really relate to things like in-stream flow requirements, restrictions that are going to impact imported water supply, and also any ecological considerations for topics and things like endangered species and how that impacts, for example, groundwater dependent ecosystems would be one example there. As we keep moving here, we're going to transition from sort of the policy focus to understanding more of and a stronger focus on more the physical risk and looking at our vulnerability and risk assessments and the components that have gone into that. And so as we started with this, you'll see a nice little graphic here. This is our watershed graphic. And across this graphic, you'll notice we've got some climate threats represented. So we've got sea level rise, increased storm intensity, flooding, wildfire, drought. We've included saltwater intrusion into the groundwater basin, not necessarily as an individual climate threat in itself, but are influenced by some of the other climate threats that we have represented. Due to its relevance, we've made sure to include it in this graphic as well. A couple of things to note here, one being that the climate scenarios that we're working with are really a combination of understanding what are the potential climate threats and the potential events that can be derived as a result of these climate threats. And this really describes, when we're talking about scenarios here, we're not giving a specific number of 3 feet exactly of sea level rise. We're looking at general trends in an increase in intensity or frequency of these events, looking at current state of science. And that science is derived from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report 6, and even more so on our California 4th Climate Change Assessment as providing the general, the scientific basis for these trends that we're looking at. And this really is to describe what are some of the changing future conditions that we may be seeing and experiencing across the district service area and here. Now that feeds into what we use for our vulnerability assessment. This is just an example, one of many. And really to highlight here in the top left-hand piece is an example of a scenario. And again, these are descriptive high-level scenarios for the purpose of understanding the breadth of different climate threats and what some of the events may be and their impacts across the district. So in looking at this example, we've got sea level rise as our climate risk threat. And then for the potential risk event, we have a sort of general loss of access to facilities as being a general risk event. Again, this is one of many. We originally started out with over 35 plus different scenarios, and we'll see in a moment how we sort of narrowed those down in a later slide. But in terms of the vulnerability assessment, this really elaborates on the description of potential impacts from a climate risk threat, and then what are some of, along with those impacts, what may be impacted, so looking at assets or operations impacted. And then of course, what are some of the, what's the spatial understanding of where we might see some of those impacts given current state of science, the range of different potential, in this case, sea level rise levels, and being able to demonstrate that with some hotspot maps. This example here is derived from our Adapting to Rising Tides BCBC data. They looked at a medium high risk aversion and high emission scenario. And really what I'd like folks to take from that is that this would be a little more dramatic than maybe some of the other mapping you would see from other studies in terms of demonstrating a 0 to 12 foot type of sea level rise. Now, in moving from our vulnerability assessment to the risk assessment, we are taking our scenarios, and for each one of these and the elaboration thereof, we are looking at what a likelihood value may be based on those trends and scientific data, and then also what are some of the potential consequences when we talk about impacts. And within the likelihood values, we looked at two different planning horizons, one being a midterm 2050 and the other long-term 2100 for potential consequences. There were some specific reasons we had chosen those, in part based on some of the capital planning, looking at a 75-year outlook for life cycle of assets, but then also looking at current state of science and what some of the key values mid-century and end of century were in terms of looking at output for various models. And then when we pivot over to our consequence score, so this is based on consequence criteria, we'll flash on the screen in a moment, and really looking at what are some of the key system components, how might those be impacted from a descriptive sense, and then looking at are there already some adaptive capacities in place that would help reduce some of those potential consequences? How could we describe and understand that? The combination of both of these, looking at likelihood value and consequence scores, gives us an overall risk score. And when we look at that sort of bottom half of this slide, we're looking at the different sort of components that help us understand reduction in overall risk and how we might increase overall resilience. And those two pieces being, I mentioned, adaptive capacity, that looks at existing plans, actions, what we already have in place to help reduce those climate risks. And then what are some that are not already in place that we may consider to further reduce that risk? And that's represented by our adaptation strategies. All right, just to give a brief view here, instead of 35 plus, we're looking at a number of 1 through 15 for our scenarios. And what you'll notice in terms of how this is structured is that we have the climate threat in bold and the risk event that follows. And what you can see across the 15 is that we've got sort of a range of potential events based on increasing temperature, drought, wildfire, sea level rise, flooding, as well as some regulatory changes at the bottom there. And we'll kind of come back to that in a moment. So just to kind of give you, without going into each line here, the full range of what we were looking at across the scenarios. Now, for each one of these, we took a look at likelihood values. We mentioned this just a couple slides previous. This is to give a little bit more detail here. There, again, being a higher level assessment, climate risk assessment, we're looking at trying to find proxies, relative measures of understanding differences between likelihoods and risk scores at the end of what we're trying to evaluate. And so when we're looking at likelihood values, we're establishing these values on a scale of 1 low to 5 high. The justification on that right-hand side is just really what shows you where we've, what resources we've used to derive that trend. And we've got some further explanation in terms of what we mean by these 5s and 4s, but a couple of things to identify here is that you'll see a lot of on this screen 4s and 5s, and that should come as a surprise. The climate threats that we're looking at and evaluating here, we notice hurricanes are not on here, winter storms are not on here. These are meant to be ones that are going to have a higher likelihood, and you'll see there are some differences between potential midterm and long-term likelihood as well. Last thing to mention on this one is just that this is based on the existing science, but when we looked at applying this within our what's called our risk matrix, where we've included all of this information in one place, these values are adjusted downward when applied to each scenario when, for example, there's really not an ability for or a very limited ability to produce adverse impacts. So likelihood of a climate risk or threat in general implies that there needs to be some propensity to produce an adverse impact. So it's something that we needed to keep in mind as we're going through this part of the process. Now, the consequence side of this, these are our consequence criteria that we're using to characterize impacts. What you'll see on the left-hand side is really a listing of the various criteria. Some of these are going to hopefully be a little more familiar and noticeably connected to some of the criteria throughout planning and policy for the district. Wanted to make sure that we sort of ground these with existing district policy and also as they pertain to system elements, which you see on the right-hand side. So we'll see from water delivery, quality, supply, looking at facility reliability and redundancy, finance, all the way down through stewardship, safety, and of course, equitable service. And we've got further elaboration of what we mean by each of these, but this is just at a kind of a high level to look at the sort of span of what we're looking at here. Now, we took a look at each of these criterion, and there's a lot going on this slide. However, we're just going to identify the general process that this is representing and kind of walk through that briefly. So for each of these scenarios, and you'll see an example here with scenario 4, the drought as the climate risk threat, and the potential imported supply reduction as the risk event. And then looking here at each one of these criteria, assigning a value of either 1, a negligible impact, to 5, a severe impact. There's further write-up of sort of what we mean by that for each one of these in terms of the 1 through 5. We establish values, you'll see represented next to each of sort of the icons in blue for what the potential impact is. And then you'll see in the sort of blue, and I'll put my mouse over this so we can see that the blue text identifies what are some of the existing adaptive capacities that would make this really a 4 instead of a 5. And what we mean by that is we assume that if existing adaptive capacities are in place, that the highest score value in terms of impact is likely not as applicable. And so this is just to give an example of what that looks like. And as we sort of move to the next piece here, but elaborating a little bit more and giving an example for adaptive capacity, really, again, this highlights what the district is already doing. And so to give some examples here, we're focused on sea level rise in this slide, really looking at across 3 scenarios. We've got saline intrusion in Delta, groundwater mobilization of contaminants for scenario 8, and then damage to infrastructure. So that was us. And what we see across the board here for adaptive capacity is really some options that when we think about sort of impacts and primarily targeting, looking at what can happen with our groundwater system. There are a range of different activities that are already in place and underway that help us reduce potential impacts. And so this just gives you kind of an example of what some of those existing activities already are and how we can communicate that as corresponding to supporting risk reduction for those potential climate threats. Now, we kind of shift over back to our risk score components. These are our key components, just as a reminder here. No need to squint at your scenarios list. That's the same as what we had taken a look at before on that left-hand side. But this is just to really highlight what we're looking at in terms of likelihood, consequence being combined to produce your risk scores across the different scenarios. And when we look at these risk scores, there may be a few scores that you may have some questions about. There may be I need to sort of explain a few assumptions. And so on this next slide, we have a few assumptions we just want to highlight here that are important when we're considering the output and these risk scores and what they're telling us. So the first one being that all criteria that we're looking at, each of those criteria are weighted equally for this initial study. Of course, changing weightings for different criteria is going to change your output and risk score. For sea level rise scenarios, we definitely recommend some consideration of refinement for their studies, and that's something we discussed with staff will appear also in our recommendation slide at a later part of this presentation. And then for our regulatory and legislative changes, yes, those are high. The reason being that we assume a relatively high likelihood of change within our planning horizons, but then also a potential dramatic impact across a broad range of criteria. So just to communicate the rationale for that. A few other items to consider here, really for wildfire, where that's impacted and some high impact in a couple of criteria bump those scores up. And then the delta scenarios, and this is important to mention given previous analysis from the district. In this case, we're not assuming a catastrophic delta failure. And so that's something to keep in mind here. And this last piece, again, looking at state water project potential reductions, this could be refined and adjusted with criteria weighting and may bump up that score as a result of further refinement. So just to kind of keep that in mind. Now, the differences that you'll see between midterm and long-term risk scores, just want to highlight first coming up with the midterm scores here. Purpose of showing you this is really to kind of list out. We do have in order of sort of highest to lowest score. And you'll notice that there are a few scenarios, scenario 10 down through 11 there, that when we look at our long-term score, tend to shift, they tend to jump up. And that's a result of what we're assuming for our likelihood value and how that's represented. So it's really sort of a testament to, depending on what planning horizon you're looking at, there may be a different sort of set of priorities in terms of what kind of risks we're trying to address and who may want to sequence that. So just something to keep in mind here as we look at those differences in scores. And now some general observed results based on that scoring. And again, this is not taking adaptation strategies into account. This is looking at our current state and current practices and actions. So some priorities, and we're looking over the next 25 years. That midterm, again, looking at the midterm values. We've got top 5, and then within top 10, of course, some of our potentially lower priority risks that we're identifying. And in that top 5, you'll see regulatory changes, supply focus, and when we look over to our next 50 years, so shifting to that long-term, sort of the changes, what you may see, you still see the regulatory change and reduced local supply at the top. However, there's a little bit of a shift there in terms of drought reducing supply for groundwater recharge, and also the increase in temperature impacting the delta, assuming that's going to be on a continuously increasing trajectory as well. And then we still have increased demand as a core component of those top 5. Top 10 differences, you still see that saline intrusion impacting the delta. And then we've got the contamination mobilization for groundwater still included. A little bit of a shift down with respect to relative risk scores for saltwater intrusion, however, still very relevant and very important. And then also a few shifts for impacts from wildfire. And then, of course, our drought impacts are still going to remain a top priority there in that top 10. When we're looking at lower priority risks, one thing to call out here is that the lower priority risks remain pretty consistent when we're looking at damage to infrastructure and loss of access, PSPS as well. And that in part is a result of us taking into account your already existing adaptive capacity and potential limited spatial overlay when we're looking at some of the hazard mapping, at least for anticipated conditions. All right, that's quite a bit here. We're going to shift our pace. If the folks are falling asleep, maybe move the shoulders and hands and feet a little bit. So a little pause there. We are going to shift to our adaptation strategies. And in this case, we've taken that understanding of the risks, the risk assessment, our current actions, and what we're looking at for prioritization of just across the board for mid and long term risks and scoring. And now we're going to think about potential adaptation strategies, how we could pursue those, and what they may look like. And so what we've done here is looked at a range of different plans, programs, activities that may go above and beyond the current actions that the district already has in place. What you'll see here is in that right-hand side is a bit of a matching game, for nice little arrows, where we're looking at potential adaptation strategies and how they may match up to and help address various climate risk scenarios. And so this is a little snippet of what the climate adaptation team knows is a much larger measles chart to line up our adaptation strategies and potential scenarios. It's really just to kind of give you a nice visual layout of sort of what could we use to start to address some of these scenarios. And again, we're not quantifying these, we're understanding the connecting points and what are some strategies and direction to try to provide there. The categories here just kind of give you an understanding of sort of broad range of the types of strategies we're looking at. One thing to note here is that we're not getting into specific projects because we're not necessarily quantifying the impacts and how we're reducing that. But again, this is to give some guidance, and there are examples that we can talk about with various kinds of projects, plans, or approaches. So in playing that matching game, this sort of helps us understand, and I know there's a lot going on this slide, but I will walk us through some of the bubbles here to guide our attention. These adaptation strategies can be used to reduce our consequence scores, and that's how we're using that in this study. So we've got the scores that you'd seen previously with those icons and that blue text that represent our current actions only. So when we're looking at sort of this top bubble here, consequence scores with current actions, including the adaptive capacity, those are what you see across the board at the top here. And then on the left-hand side, you'll see in the black text, those are our applicable adaptation strategies that we've listed and matched up in that measles chart. And in looking at each one of those, we take a look at sort of three options here. Is there a potential benefit that adaptation strategy can derive for this particular criterion? If not, then that's represented by 0. And then again, showing just as part of the high level, not going into too detailed quantification, but indicating relative difference. We're looking at the other two options being, is there a way that we can pretty confidently say that there will be some improvement derived from that adaptation strategy? Or are we pretty confident that this is a substantial improvement or could provide a substantial improvement? And so that's what you see represented in the green text there in this right-hand side. So just to kind of show what that difference may be. And as we move forward here, this is supposed to be going through a video, which apparently I'm hoping that it shows as a video where you're on. If it's not, what it should be highlighting is the fact that we've taken all of this information and we have put that into a tool, an Excel-based tool, and that will be provided to the district for further use. We try to make sure that what we're providing is not black box, so folks are able to adjust this later for future planning. But what you'll see at this top piece here is that you can select different scenarios, and as you choose different scenarios, all of the bar chart items here will adjust. And these items in the middle are representing the various impacts for the different consequence criteria and what the different adaptation strategies, how they might benefit those different criteria. So for example, you've got your green infrastructure up at the top, and you'll see that there are, for scenario 1, increasing temperature and reducing local supply, you'll see that there are quite a few different criteria that can potentially benefit, just as an example. You can also change the planning horizon. You'll notice up here, if you squint real hard, that there is a midterm likelihood, and you can adjust that to a long-term likelihood, and you'll see some differences there in terms of what will pop up for your overall scoring, and that will be on our next slide. But before we get there, this really is to communicate what are some of the benefits of different adaptation strategies relative to each other and across consequence scores. And now if we go to this next piece here, this is really, there's really three things to try to communicate here. On our left-hand side, we've got again, the adaptation strategies. On our right-hand side, we've got our scenarios 1 through 15. And in the middle, the story that we're telling for the midterm likelihood based output is that you can really see that some of the adaptation strategies derive multiple benefits across scenarios. So this is where you're looking at your multi-benefit adaptation strategies. And you'll note that there are varying sizes for some of these bars, looking at what kind of benefit can be derived. And then also, again, the length of the bar, meaning across how many different scenarios. So some highest performing strategies, if we're just looking at some general observations from that output. Some that perform again well across multiple scenarios is our multi-benefit strategies. First one being that green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, followed by partnerships, as well as the developing the local supply. We've got some honorable mentions here, and those include things like securing new imported supply, distribution flexibility, and then of course our long-term use efficiency and augmentation for recharge both locally and also with semi-tropic. And then of course the watershed management focused forest and vegetation management. The low to no regret strategies we mentioned before, just want to call out here that quite a few of these are low to no regret strategies. And so we're talking about those are key themes here. So you'll see some modeling and monitoring as a key part there with our first two bullets, as well as both the short-term and the long-term conservation efficiency efforts. And then partnerships follows that, as well as our green infrastructure. And those can kind of go hand in hand when you're looking at implementing different programs or projects across a wider scale for greater benefit and looking at a longer term planning horizon. So just a few notes for our highest performing strategies there. This is definitely more of a reference slide because of our copious amount of text. But again, this is really to provide an example using that midterm likelihood value of the various adaptation strategies that can address the different scenarios. These are ranked in terms of top 10 using the midterm likelihood. And what you'll see on this right-hand side of the adaptation strategies is that some of these have a wider range of potential strategies that can be applicable and derive benefit for that particular scenario. And then there are also some key criterion that we see can be benefited from these strategies. And so for each one of these, you'll kind of see what we mean with whether or not there's a wide range or a limited range. A limited range can mean an adaptation gap. However, that requires a little bit of a deeper dive because you may have a climate risk that really doesn't necessarily need 5 different strategies, but one very effective one that can be implemented over a near or long-term planning horizon. So just to keep that in mind, we do want to recognize there can be some potential gaps, but limited range doesn't necessarily include a deficit. It is something to pay attention to. Now, we looked at our risk and oh, I'm sorry, please.
Tess, yeah, just quickly, just
Yes.
want to pause here for a moment. You've covered a whole lot of information so far. I know we've got a little more to do, but it might be a good time just to see what folks, if there's any questions or input at this stage from the members of the public or from the board, just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what we've covered so far.
Absolutely.
All right. First of all, is there any questions, members of the board?
None over here? Zero?
Commissioner Sethy,
Yes.
please.
First of all, this is an excellent document that you're creating, and I know we're just scratching the surface, right?
Yes.
So by the time we're done here, we're going to have a very good document that will help lead the board, the community, our future staffs here at the district for many years to come. I do want to comment on one particular aspect of what I'm seeing here. I sat through a Department of Water Resources seminar presentation for 3 hours earlier this month on the subject of mega droughts and mega floods in California history. And I have a very nice short document from Scientific America that graphically shows going back to the year, going back 2,000 years, the geological, paleontological records, tree ring records that show that we have major floods on the West Coast from British Columbia down to Mexico that occur at intervals of about 200 years, but even on shorter time spans. And so we had the last major flood in 1862, which devastated the state, almost bankrupted the state, and extended all the way from British Columbia down to Mexico. And the entire Central Valley was flooded 300 miles in length and 20 miles across for 6 months. And that was at a time when we had not really built out the levees in the Delta. So on one of your earlier slides, you say that catastrophic failure to the Delta is not a scenario that we are taking into account. And I would say that based on at least the DWR forecasts and those from other universities here in California,
Mhm.
that has to be taken into consideration. Because we're now 160 years away from that last mega flood. And regardless of whether you believe in climate change or not, these events are more likely to happen with increasing temperatures, which is what they were showing.
Right.
And that we have a 2 in 3 chance in the next 50 years of one of these megastorms occurring. On a monthly basis at our regular board meeting, we have our presentation on rainfall for the season.
Mhm.
And I lived through the 1982 season, which was the peak year that we always show, where all the freeways were flooded in the South Bay,
Mhm.
could not get to work anywhere for a month.
Mhm.
They had to elevate the entire Nimitz Freeway quite a bit because we're in a floodplain down here in Warm Springs.
Mhm.
And Alvisa was flooded out. The other side on the peninsula on 101 was flooded out. And so if we're going to have one of those megastorms,
Mhm.
you have to imagine what kind of devastation that's going to bring to the state. And one of the scenarios is that the levee system will completely break down
Right.
in a mega flood. And as water is receding, we're going to have saltwater intrusion all the way down to the state and federal pumping plants in Tracy. And although we don't wish it to happen,
Mhm.
what the science community is saying is that it is very much likely to happen. And the window is closing on us in terms of when that event might be.
Mhm.
So I think that's something that has to be calculated into our strategy here.
Mhm.
I have to leave it up to the experts here in the room to determine what a mega flood would mean to our community. What are the coordination efforts with Alameda County Flood Control?
Mhm.
What impact it has to our facilities? What impact it has to residences that are at the lowest elevations in our community. So that's where I would like to see some additional thought put in. That's scenario number 12 that you have here.
Mhm.
Otherwise, I'm very pleased with everything I'm seeing here.
Okay.
Thank you. You have not finished your report. Will there be any business case scenario provided in your report? The cost?
Yes, so one of the, well, for cost, we do already have this was part of what we had discussed it with the previous board meeting, is to understand potential order of magnitude costs for some of the adaptation strategies, especially some of the more, let's say, higher impact or more beneficial adaptation strategies. So there's a table that we've included and completed in an appendix that represents that information. And I don't know if that addresses your question. I want to make sure to clarify.
Do you have a cost estimate with any of your strategies?
We
You
have
proposed a number of strategies. Will be a cost estimate associated with those strategies?
we have a high level order of magnitude estimate using also examples from other places where this
Okay.
into effect.
Is that part of this report or would that be separate?
No, that's that's not included in our presentation today, but that is in the appendix that's been completed already for the.
I look forward to seeing that. When San Francisco did a similar study, their consultant said $35 per unit, which is 5 times the current cost. But if we were to project that into, at least it was $2 a unit increase in their cost, funded a $6 billion retrofit of the San Francisco system, which would extrapolate to a $90 billion investment on the part of San Francisco. And there's no one that's ever envisioned how they're going to spend $90 billion. So there's been some huge disconnects. Second,
Mhm.
you conspicuous, to me, conspicuous by its absence is anything dealing with an unlimited water supply in the San Francisco Bay. Have you looked at Bay Desal?
They desal as a strategy to be employed as an adaptation
As a
strategy?
water supply, as an unlimited water supply that's readily available.
I don't think we have that as a, actually, no, that would fall under, existing or enhancing or creating. I believe we still put that under, we've got a local/regional enhancement or creation of new supply. And we've got examples of what that means underneath, for each of those, and that would fall, within that general adaptation strategy. And I know that doesn't sound very descriptive, because we're trying to look at this at a high level and not get to a focal point of specific projects, but we're trying to give examples of what kinds of projects, plans or activities would fall under those strategies, and strategies being represented as sort of a bundle of those kinds of options. So, and I want to be transparent about, how we're including that. So the very short answer is yes, but it's a very limited inclusion. And it'd be more of a mention than it is a full elaboration of that as a very specific option or project.
Well, let me encourage you to consider that as a scenario that addresses the entirety of our water supply requirements. Next, you've identified a 7-foot sea level rise as a medium risk. It strikes me that's twice as high as what I've seen coming out of the state of California.
Sure.
And statements by the Delta masters saying that if they get a 2-foot sea level rise, they've lost the Delta. So that's so again, I think following up on Director Sethy, I'm concerned that none of your scenarios recognize that the Delta is doomed. Corps of Engineers wrote a report to that effect in the late 1990s. And I think we're in never land to ignore the fact that to assume that we're going to have a functioning Delta under any of these criteria. When you lose the Delta as a freshwater ecosystem and related social and economic impacts,
Right.
the entire equation changes. You're no longer worrying about unimpaired flows.
Right.
Dennis Herrera wrote a letter to the state pointing out that the current unimpaired flows in the San Joaquin, which are driving this study and much of the others, were really an effort to use the senior water rights of MID, TID, and San Francisco in lieu of the junior water rights of the federal and state to prolong the life of the Delta. I think anyone with any common sense realizes that the Delta is doomed. And at 7 feet sea level rise, even the Delta Conveyance Project makes no sense. So we've got some disconnects here, I believe.
Sure.
I've got a number of other issues related to, but those are more philosophical. Fundamentally, that comes down to our reaction, or our responses to this, and that we have a 5-year IRP. You're looking at a 70-year or 80-year project concern. And so hopefully that timelines come into play, because even any of the major projects, whether it be LVE or Delta Conveyance, are at least 15 and maybe 20, 30 years out. So I'm not certain we've put those timelines into, at least in this report, that I haven't seen a reference to realistic timelines. Thank you.
I'm happy to address some of the comments that and input that we received, or I'm happy to check and make sure if there are any other comments to try to take note of first.
Do we have any comments from my staff or questions by staff?
No, and I'm checking the list of the public present. And if you have a question or comment, feel free to raise your hand and we'll make sure you get a chance. Otherwise, I think it'd be appropriate for Tess to respond to some of those items brought up.
Yes, and also Director Sethy, Director Weed, I really appreciate some of the feedback and the comments that you've made, because there are a few things we can, I think, clarify. Just looking at the 7 foot, and that may be derived from that example slide we showed you just with the range from ACWD. So what we're providing in this this report is not one specific number. It's really to understand the range based on some of the existing science. So we are not saying that we're looking at only a 7 foot sea level rise. Actually, some of the studies that we rely on from BCDC tend to put the more plausible range from a 3 foot by 20, I believe it's 2050 or 2060. My apologies, I'll have to double check the exact year for that one. And then on the longer time horizon, up to a 6 foot, which of course is still beyond that 2 foot that Director Lee that you had mentioned in terms of catastrophic impact to the Delta. So that's definitely something to make note of, and something that we should include in the report in our vulnerability section. In the vulnerability section of the report, we discuss in attempted concise form the existing science and the ranges that are presented in terms of what we're looking at for various levels and where that comes from. And so that's part of how we're trying to document what the state of science is, what we're referencing in those ranges instead of a specific number. And the reason for that is really because there's a high degree of uncertainty with extrapolating some of these numbers, especially for longer term planning horizons. So it's not specifically a 7 foot of sea level rise, but it's very prudent to call attention to the fact that there is a threshold of understanding for catastrophic failure for the Delta. And that's something that's important to mention here. We called out in the assumptions that we're not assuming a catastrophic impact for the Delta looking at that scenario, because we wanted to look at if there are impacts but not a catastrophic impact, what can we think about for potential preparation for or response with implemented adaptation strategies. The catastrophic impact is something that the district has also looked at in previous studies when we're considering, I think this was part of their, I'm trying to recall here, but there was a combination of confluence of various threats looked at for a previous study in terms of catastrophic impact for the Delta that would render it really no longer a source of supply for the district. And that there was a contingency plan established for what are some considerations in the case of that kind of catastrophic failure. So in giving credit to the fact that there has been an assessment of a catastrophic failure previously, we did want to try to look at, in the case that it's not a catastrophic failure, but definitely an impact, if it's not something that's a rapid onset hazard that renders a catastrophic failure, but something less than, how are we taking that into account? And that was part of the rationale for the scenarios you currently see existing in the study and slides now.
I would like to thank you for including the map of a 7 foot sea level rise. City of Fremont has just authorized a 3-city hazardous mitigation plan. And I think that will be informative to them. They refuse to cooperate with the BCDC to date to acknowledge sea level rise. And Director Sethy will have them clearly have a display for the city on what the master flood will be in the city of Fremont, with half the city underwater. So, and then City of Fremont did not want to work with ACWD when they did their hazardous mitigation plan either. We did work with Union City and Newark.
Okay.
So
We were recently in the Newark Days Parade, all of us as directors, and I was joking about their theme, which was under the sea. I said, it's very likely that we could all be under the sea in that part of our service district.
Newark had a.
Let me finish.
Okay.
Ever since I've been on the board, and this is my 12th year, the things that I worry about the most are a major quake on the Hayward Fault that last happened in 1868, and then that great flood event, which happened 6 years earlier, and leading to catastrophic failure of the Delta. And I think that and I know this kind of leads into the risk assessment and
Mhm.
all the emergency preparations that we make, but those are the two events that I worry about the most, where we really need to think through every step of how we're going to deal with some event like that when it happens.
Okay.
And I know we have a follow-up workshop coming up on, emergency preparation.
Well, with this report, Newark suggested that they change their name to Newark by the Bay, one of the council members, when they were getting involved in all the Newarks of the world and met in England. But Newark in the Bay would be the clear identification of this, regardless of what they do. That town is gone.
Let's not try to destroy everybody's real estate values.
Not just tonight.
Maybe, yeah.
Could I,
maybe move on from
I-
there. I think.
Yes,
Yes.
Yes, I'd like to just intercept for 1 second,
Yes.
because I think the questions and the response from our consultant team has been excellent here. And I just want to put the context of what this study is giving us.
Hmm.
Very high flyover, prioritizing risks, vulnerability risk, and priority actions for us to take in the near term. So in application, and I should have said this at the front, we actually haven't received the final report yet. So there's a lot of detail in the report that staff has not yet had the chance to review. But in application of this discussion we're having here tonight, how are we going to use this information in our IRP update? What we're learning from this study is for the next 25 years, the Delta doesn't appear to be doomed. But those worsening scenarios coming after 2050 are real.
Mhm.
That can give a lot of direction for decision-making by this board and will inform priorities within the IRP plan, which has a 25, 30-year purview. And do we want to go for the end zone and solve all the global climate change problems today? Or do we want to work with what we can, mitigate costs, take smaller, reasonable actions, and watch how adaptation and mitigation maybe works as we get closer to those more serious sort of future scenarios? And that's what we get to, that no regrets decision-making. We don't necessarily want to solve a perceived problem that's 100 years out, because our certainty about that problem is pretty thin. Or do we want to bite off what we can chew and pursue prudent planning and set ourselves up and mitigate risk for the beyond 2050 scenario? So I think right here, where you're already jumping 3 steps ahead together with me, is getting into how are we going to use this information. So I think it's been a great conversation. I just wanted to share that perspective of why we're here and how we're going to use this report.
Thank you, Thomas. Appreciate that. I know we've got some notes taken too from some of the comments received from Director Sethy, Director Reed, and some of this conversation again. Thank you for that. And we'll discuss with staff and also consider maybe some tweaks and changes to how we're framing a few of the things that we've got lined up in the report currently. If it's all right with the board, I'd like to recommend we keep moving along. Maybe another.
Yep, I think that's great. I'll just note quickly that we had another, I assume, member of the public join us with a telephone, area code 240. So just as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, participate, you can use *9 on your dial pad to raise or lower your hand, or *6 to mute and unmute yourself. But with that, Tess?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to have a break, but you still have you complete your report.
Yes. Yes. All right. So, oh, I'm sorry. Was there additional comment there? Okay.
No.
Make it.
Without
Sure.
any further questions, please proceed.
Oh, okay. Thank you. All right. So going into our last piece of the 4 main sort of meat components to this study, we're getting into our guiding adaptive pathways. And just as kind of a refresh of what we mean by that, we're really taking that information from the vulnerability assessment, our risk assessment, looking at a current adaptive capacity, but also looking at those adaptation strategies and thinking through how would we, as conditions change over time, think about what we might implement and when we might start to make decisions ahead of those changing conditions. So really how we're sort of thinking through and getting towards implementation and sort of a higher level planning approach for that. So Adaptation pathways, some assumptions, and let's start off with the definition because those are always fun. What we mean by adaptive pathways, really, in this sense, for this project, we are in study. These are meant to depict both mid and long-term adaptation strategies and decision points. These are really to inform sort of when to prepare for or enact changes. And when we talk about the when, this is more along a sort of spectrum of changing conditions, not a specific year, but really looking at how do we prepare and anticipate for those changing conditions. And so there are a few other assumptions we want to relay here as we get towards our example that we'll have. It's a sea level rise example. We developed pathways for 6 of the top ranking long-term risk scores for those scenarios. The reason why you see 6 is really when we're looking at top 5, we also wanted to make sure we had a relatively good breadth of the types of climate threats that were represented. So we've got our 6 there, and looking at long-term because we're really trying to think about both the mid and the long-term trajectory of changing conditions as we're thinking about potential triggers. So just to keep that in mind. A few notes on strategies. So some strategies are going to be able to reduce climate risk events and their impacts to a certain extent. And we're assuming that maybe more than one strategy should be pursued concurrently to try to reduce risk. And then there are some strategies that may provide a permanent solution to mitigate risk, depending on the scenario. So just to keep that in mind, taking a deeper dive into which strategy is employed, what kinds of projects may follow, is something that can help us sort of suss out whether or not a permanent solution via a single strategy would be the right pathway forward. And then one thing to think about here is, again, when we're talking about increasing changing conditions, and when I say increasing, what I mean is really a progression of what we assume to be more of towards a worst case scenario. So for sea level rise or temperature increasing, that upward trend is what we're thinking about as a changing condition over time. And really that's for the purpose of implementing and eventually exhausting some of the adaptation strategies that we have and looking at what might be implemented sooner rather than later. And then a nod to our no to low regret strategies as well. When we're talking about efficiencies, conservation, partnerships, some of these are really important long-term actions that derive benefit and will continue deriving benefit, but may be strategies that we want to put and continue to utilize in tandem with other solutions. So just to make a note or nod there. For the study, these are the 6 different scenarios we had looked at for developing an adaptive pathway scenario. Sorry, my words a little bubble there, but so for our adaptive pathway scenarios, we're looking at increasing temperatures. There's a couple there, and then drought as well as wildfire, and of course sea level rise. So you'll see sort of a range of the different types of scenarios we wanted to make sure to represent. And now, when we talk about an adaptive pathway, we have tried to create some graphics that represent. They're going to look like there are quite a few pieces to them because there are. And so I'll walk through some key components to sort of concentrate our attention. But really the focus is to look at a specific scenario, look at potential triggers, and understand that as conditions change, we may want to think about, at what point do we make a decision to start working toward implementing a different strategy or changing course. And so with that, I will pivot to, we've got one more, so that's right. This one is a little bit easier on the eyes before we get to our more detailed slide there. We've got an example, and this is sort of to cue up that slide, an example with sea level rise. So some of the triggers we're looking at in progression of higher severity is related to water quality changes. This is in terms of higher salinity levels, degrading water quality for the basin, and really looking at triggers as that trigger 1 being, well, there are some quantifiable changes that we see in water quality. However, we really can use the same treatment methods we've been using. That trigger 2 is, well, we've gotten to a point where we're approaching a threshold where the water quality change really is going to require some different treatment methods. And then that third piece is, we still have a source, but really it's going to be cost prohibitive to try to treat it to the point where we can use it for what we've intended it for. So that sort of increasing progression of changing conditions and looking at that as representing different triggers for action and how and when we might change course for what we're implementing. And so when you switch over to this slide here, A lot going on here, but let's just direct our attention to the top. So we're looking at an example of an adaptive pathway. And that's scenario 9, that sea level rise, water quality changes, and now is come due to saline intrusion. And so this is what we were looking at just to that previous slide with the triggers. So these are the same here. And these triggers are represented on this graphic here, representing these triangles. And what we're looking at is as saline levels increase, this is your changing condition on the bottom. You'll see that you've got your different triggers represented as those conditions change in progression. And then what we're starting with over here, these are the different kinds of actions, different strategies that could be put in place. And so at the bottom, you'll see sort of a bunching of a few of these. These are our low to no regret strategies, which we assume should be put in place pretty early on and remain consistent and derive benefit as conditions change over time. However, as we approach different triggers, there is an opportunity to employ other strategies that are, for example, with this T2, as we get towards this point, the decision of what kind of strategies to employ as we need some maybe potential changes in treatment. And then if we're looking at this being a cost prohibitive treatment, then looking at new supply options is then another pivot point. And you'll see some of these are assumed to derive benefit up to a certain point, and then maybe have a pretty reduced marginal benefit after a certain condition is reached. So really this is to highlight your decision points, potential triggers leading up to those decision points, and what are some of the strategies we can think about that may correspond to when we think about those changing conditions and what we could implement. And so that's really at kind of a high level. I know we could take a deeper dive into some of these, but what we're looking at when we talk about an adaptive pathway and how that can help us in terms of our mid to long-term planning and decision making. Now with that, we're going to take a breath there, because that's also quite a bit that we just digested, and look at our key takeaways and next steps. So as we transition to the key takeaways, you should see some familiar text on that left-hand side, and that's our priorities being reiterated here. So really starting from the top, that fostering alignment across planning efforts, some key observations. So existing criteria that we already have in district planning provides a good start to expand upon, and this is really in terms of understanding district priorities. There are also opportunities here to align some of our planning, our major planning, excuse me, major planning documents and directions under a common climate readiness goal. And in doing so, there's a lot that can be done in terms of how we frame that and how that also jives with some of the direction from state policy as well. And then a nod to the existing planning approaches and programs that really demonstrate a long history of pursuing that reliability and resilience that's evident and good to give some credit toward. And that kind of transitions well into our next piece here in terms of identifying and prioritizing climate risks and vulnerabilities. First part of that being the considerable existing adaptive capacity. And a lot of that is really translating what's already been done and currently being done into how that helps us mitigate in terms of reduced risk for potential climate threats. And then there's another piece here when we're talking about some of the risks outside of district control. And this is kind of goes back to some of the discussions that we've had with sort of external outside of the service area impacts, and how that can really emphasize and encourage enhancing local supply and strengthening existing partnerships and potential new partnerships. And really that's for both watershed and regional efforts. Looking at highest risk areas, you can see some of those identified there. And for that, I believe I looked at more of the long-term items here. That's what you see listed without going into each item. And then looking towards what we do about some of these risks, identifying those greatest benefits from some of these adaptation strategies, and working towards implementing those and achieving our climate readiness. We've got some of those listed here, including partnerships, green infrastructure, et cetera. And then we've also got, again, a nod to leveraging some of these partnerships. One of the things I'll mention here is not just for the watershed scale management, but also coastal monitoring, avoiding some maladaptations or unintended negative consequences when some projects or plans are kind of done in isolation. And it sounds from hearing some comments from this board, partnerships are more welcome. But also a nod here to the low to no regret strategies and how some of these, especially for our adaptation strategies, really can build from existing adaptive capacity. And so that's a positive there to document and acknowledge. The last piece here, and certainly one of the most important when we're thinking about moving forward, is how we're communicating findings, again, through some of these workshops, also in creation of a public-facing summary that will accompany our strategy or our report. Another piece here, though, is looking at what are some of the next steps that we can communicate as well. And so getting to our last slide here of the evening before the other components of our overall discussion are really the recommended studies and some planning strategies. And here we sort of branch them under enhancing adaptive planning, looking at additional modeling and analysis, and then also at that last bit here, the further support for decision-making. There's some items identified there. For enhancing adaptive planning, what we're looking at here is really refining some of those thresholds. So taking a more rigorous look at some of the specific risks and understanding, for example, at what level of salinity would that trigger a need to change in our treatment operations? Can we understand, do we already have an understanding of what that looks like? Can we sort of map that out? And then under additional modeling and analysis, something that also harkens back to our comment from the public earlier today is understanding impact of sea level rise and looking at saline intrusion and how do we simulate and predict some of the mobility in terms of time of travel, extent, distance of chlorides in the Noscona Basin. The other piece here kind of gets towards, I would say toward, but maybe not exactly at that catastrophic scenario we were mentioning before, and this is more of a direction of drought that we're looking at, but a sort of perfect storm analysis for drought and taking a deeper dive into some credible characteristics for a climate-driven drought scenario that considers both imported and local supplies and sort of that design drought. What would that look like if we took a deeper dive into that? The other piece here is a recommendation for a watershed climate study, and some of the thoughts around this one are really looking at the Alameda Creek watershed boundary for that climate study, and also working in partnership with various cities, and then the flood control district, as well as the Alameda Creek Watershed Forum. With the thought here that the district could be a key lead for that study and coordination. The last two pieces here we'll mention under the further support for future decision making are really when we talk about a climate resilient CIP. What we mean by that is not an overhauling of your CIP. There are actually quite a few projects that already contribute to the existing or our documentation of adaptive capacity, and for those not implemented yet, some of the adaptation strategies that could be put in place. But really, in terms of the write-up and how this is presented, and understanding how you're documenting some of your risks and how some of the projects that you are considering are able to help mitigate those risks, and if there's a way to quantify that as well, this would be very important. One of the things I'll add here is that we've been sort of monitoring, keeping an ear to developments, and this might sound like a little bit of a tangent, but very highly relevant to insurance agencies, issues for creditworthiness. There's sort of this not necessarily transition, but this recognition from insurers and from creditors for utilities that these climate risks need to be taken into account, and utilities will need to start demonstrating how they are documenting those risks and also documenting how they're mitigating those risks. And so this is something that can impact potentially in the future insurability and creditworthiness that we want to also keep in mind as we're moving forward. We're thinking about how we document what we're already doing and try to reduce the risks in the future. Last couple pieces here that related, so establishing planning criteria for climate readiness, and this is something that could be done within the IRP. That can be related to how we might weight different priorities and criteria. And then as we look towards further developing adaptation strategies and more refinement potential projects, one of the things to consider here is also making sure we've got that stakeholder input to help define and refine what kinds of community level benefits could be derived. And that's also something that's beneficial when we're looking at funding opportunities and different mechanisms in that arena. So I will stop there with the monologue, but this is just to conclude some of the next steps and some of the suggestions that really coming out of what we're looking at overall, we wanted to recommend in working with the district. And again, I just wanted to thank the district, the board members, the public for the opportunity to present on our findings so far and what we've put together at this point. So Thank you for that opportunity and definitely open to revisiting any content, questions, comments, are very much welcome.
Well, thank you. Are there any comments from staff first? Any comments from members of the public? I don't see any hands. Members of the board?
I guess I'll just start with a comment. It looks like we, through Brown and Caldwell, conducted some very complex, very high level analysis. And the result is draft result seems to have identified a bunch of data gaps. We need to do new studies and potential strategies. I guess speaking as a board, I'm just going to say I look forward to see how that would impact our long-term planning and budget. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Gunther?
I do appreciate the study. Also appreciate Director Sethy's comments regarding the flood and the earthquake. But we can't hide from the fact that they're there. It could impact everything dramatically. We may not be able to adjust to it. They're certainly there and we got to identify them. Yes, we live in an area where sea level rise can impact us pretty dramatically. And we need to plan for this. I appreciate the staff is looking at this and trying to plan for it. We're lucky right now. It doesn't look that good. The study certainly look at the items here. They're not very cheery. But it could be worse, and at least we're looking at it. And I think we need to go that direction and head and try to plan long-term. We are doing our IRP reviews and, it is a 25-year document. Can we see 100 years into the future? No. But at least we're kind of aware of it rather than planning with nothing and ignoring it. And it's kind of like building on a barrier island, watching a hurricane come through. And then being, oh my God, we were destroyed. That's why it's called a barrier island. But we're not a barrier island, but we are in a Delta community, particularly a South Delta community. So it'll be interesting to see where all this leads, and hopefully we'll be able to draw some good planning and solid efforts out of it. Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate the presentation, Thomas, Tess, and the entire team. I think this is going to be one of those documents that we reference quite a bit, and one that we are able to point our customers to, because obviously all of these concerns are high-profile concerns. They're concerns that we hear from our community members all the time, and like Director Gunther mentioned, at least we can point to say that we're looking at these issues, and we are looking at ways that we can adapt to the changing environment. I'm going to be very interested to see how this impacts our long-term planning and our budgeting, like Director Huang also mentioned. But I think this presentation today did a really good job in contextualizing how we're approaching these key concerns and how we can potentially adapt to meet those challenges. So thank you.
I just have one additional comment here on the next steps. In the future, I would really like to understand what are the benefits of a watershed climate study other than providing work to other people. I mean, we have microclimates of all different types in the Bay Area. And from my perspective, we have enough scientific information available on the climate of our Bay Area region, Northern California region. So what's the cost of a watershed climate study and how does it benefit us directly?
Okay, well, thank you. I'd hope our staff would take the report and evaluate it, possibly putting a business case model against many of these scenarios. Also a dollar sign per order of magnitude. $1 million, $1 sign, 10 million, 2, 100 million, 3, billion, 4, something of that nature. Next, I am glad to see that we've identified the watershed as an important element. I believe it's it's proper management and control can greatly improve the water quality and availability of the district. And clearly the best way to assure the management is to own the watershed by a water agency and keep the parks out. Same applies to reservoirs. You have compromised the availability to use a reservoir because you park a visitor center in the bottom of it for no growth. Recognize that there are those who will use this report to try and limit development and growth in the community. But out that we would include desalination and at 7-foot sea level rise, we might well be able to repurpose our current desalination plant and be able to utilize it for bay desal. So it raises many of the issues. I would like to hopefully recognize that there is a market solution for much of this. That municipal and industrial is only 9% of the state's water use. And yet the entirety of the water conservation effort seems to be addressed to that 9%. So if we do a 20% reduction in savings, we've reduced the available water to the state by 2%, or with the water demand on the state. So a 2% reduction overall. So that is out of, it warps this entire plan and makes the issues of water crisis far greater than they need be. I'm concerned that semi-tropic, which is mentioned here, is vulnerable. That the Sigma, which has come on since we signed the contract, may be viewed as a material change, and we may not have protection. We have over 100,000 acre feet at risk. Our demands are about 10,000 acre feet. And so at least 120,000 acre feet of storage there. We have 12 years of drought supply. We recognize that a drought is episodic and therefore should be addressed as a contingency. We have seen that there's a distinction between water efficiency and conservation. Water efficiency gives you a better use of your existing water, but conservation is really out of our hands. That is the behavior of our customers. And in the past, when they've been asked to conserve, they do conserve. Did not require financial incentives. So we went through the last drought without any mandatory enforcement of our water conservation needs. We had universal support when we asked the public to conserve water. And that is your least cost water supply, particularly in a drought. But it need not be conservation for life. It's when it's needed in the contingency. Water efficiency is for life, and that gives you better utilization of your water and is something we should promote. So we've got some things to work on. I want to thank you for making the presentation. And hopefully we can put it in a context to where the state is on their planning. Recognize that this is a 80-year issue. That we need to do some internal planning beyond 5 years. We need to go out 80 years and what our thought process is. That includes acquiring properties. In the Delta, look at what Irvine Ranch did. Was sure that they had a water banking. They owned the land where they could then curtail their agriculture and utilize the water. That is a mindset we need to hopefully adopt at this district. So again, thank you for bringing to us your report.
Mhm.
Okay, and still not seeing any hands raised from our one member of the public remaining. So, but I think we do have some additional information to cap off the topic tonight, correct?
I believe this was our final piece, just in terms of the next step. I wanted to double check whether or not staff had anything they wanted to add, or Thomas, if there was anything you wanted to add, but that would, this
Sure.
marks the conclusion of what we were planning to present.
Sure, Tess, I will make just a quick transition, and I find it troubling. I'm trying to make eye contact with you, and I know you're looking from the camera probably behind. And
You have to have
I'm
eyes
very
behind your head.
conflicted.
I'll-
If I
I'll-
let my brain get, it really messes me up. So I just wanted to say a couple things. As I mentioned a moment ago, we haven't seen the report yet. We pivoted to get a summary of the results as they're presented to date for this board to take advantage of this workshop. But when we got these results, there's a couple things I wanted to point out. When we saw the conclusions, the highest vulnerability risks, the gaps, work needed, the low risk, high priority recommendations, everything made sense. Rarely do I work with a project where I get my first results back and I don't look at them and go, what about this? I'm not sure I understand this. And really it's a reflection on a couple levels. One of the quality of the work that went into this, but also the work that's been done for 20 years here by staff, thinking about climate change, assessing our vulnerabilities. We've been waiting for the data. And I want to make a comment about watershed science. We've been waiting for support from the state. We've been waiting to get that high level science to tell us, what are these risks that we have to get ready for? We know it's coming. We know the sea level is coming up. We really still don't know what the rain change patterns are going to look like in temperatures. There's several significant global models out there. There are many, many assumptions about emission scenarios that are going to fuel climate change. And so we've been thinking about it, and this report, the word that keeps coming to mind has been very validating. It's been very validating of a lot of the work that's been done by staff, not just my group, throughout the district, in thinking about what do we have to get ready for. So it's been very valuable to have that robust analysis behind it and to create that structure to support a lot of what we've understood, and then also to open our eyes to some of the other areas and weaknesses that we need to be focused on. So Tess, really just wanted to compliment the Brown Caldwell team for really an excellent job so far. And I think we'll transition out from there. You're of course welcome to stick around. Director Sethy, I did want to comment on the watershed science. We do not, when you see those studies from the state, they are taking those global circulation models and they're simulating weather patterns, and they're doing some analyses of probable possible scenarios that the models are predicting could happen. Those models are huge. They're done with large supercomputers. They're very costly. At our size, we don't have the ability to look at our local water supply, which is 40% of our system, and get that level of support and analytic support to say, what are those credible scenarios of drought? What is it that the groundwater group needs to consider for Sigma? We can look at our past history of weather, but the weather is changing. And all we've been able to do to date is to look at the past and say, well, what if it got worse? But what does worse mean? We don't know the depth and severity of a potential drought with climate change. We don't know the duration. Right now we have a 3-year and a 5-year drought. What if there is a 10-year critical drought? What if we see localized droughts that have 5 inches of rainfall as opposed to 11? We just don't know. And so that's where, if we got together as a region, we could potentially support some and pursue funding to get some of that very expensive high level analytic data generation of credible scenarios and really assess our risk at a local level. And that's just one start. The next place are watershed management, floodwater management, wetland restoration, the cities, just planting the right trees and landscaping to adapt to the future climate. There's a lot of co-benefit there that can help us because we're the ultimate downstream agency. So everything that goes on in the watershed, that's an improvement, benefits us directly. So that's a lot of where that thinking would come in. And it is definitely, in my opinion, one of the biggest areas where we would like to get more clarity. So if that's helpful.
Thank you.
Pleasure. So next steps. So as mentioned, November 16th, we're going to have a follow-up workshop. That will bring the draft final results from the recent purified water feasibility evaluation. I trip over that every time. Ms. Oshiro has been the project manager for that study and will be here with me to present the findings of that study, results of that study. We're going to start an integrated resources planning review, a little background on planning, discussion, possibly some board engagement exercises. I'm looking at the general manager here. We're still discussing what that might look like. But to get the juices flowing about what we need to be doing, what the process to update our water supply master plan is going to look like, what are the steps involved, and a little bit of discussion of where we want to go with it. And so that will really, really want to talk about a scoping exercise with the board of establishing what are going to be our goals for that study, which will help us find a lot of the work over the next couple of years. So we'll be holding that on November 16th. And there are a number of additional workshops that have also been scheduled for 2023 on water resources planning initiatives, ostensibly the IRP, but I think we'll be bringing in some other topics from time to time that relate to planning. So with that, we are done.
Thank you, Mr. Nizer. And if I could, I would just want to close by also acknowledging the few staff we have who tuned in and spent their evening with us online and have contributed to this effort. So many thanks to Leonard Ash, Russell Perry, Megan Marino, and Reka Ipagunta that have all tuned in tonight as well.
Thank you.
I think staff's happy to answer any additional questions that you might have for us. Otherwise, that's all we've brought tonight.
Thank you. I'll make one more general comment that the theme of this presentation is that sea level or that climate change is real. It's going to have dramatic impacts. There's pitifully little we can do about it. So when our expenditures and trying to modify climate change may be truly futile expenditures of little net value in the big picture. We might slow it down a bit, but clearly if we're looking at 7 feet of sea level rise, we're looking at Union Sand with recycled water, they're building at 12, they're rebuilding their facility with better part of $1 billion at a 12-foot elevation. We just had a presentation here which said that the sea level will be closer to 20 feet. So it's going to be under 6 to 7 feet of water, what they're in the process of rebuilding. So a lot of goodwill and good thoughts, but the reality is our monies need to be directed toward adaptation, not mitigation of climate. Thank you. And that means solar and other issues.
Maybe just a little context on that so we don't get too fixated on a specific 7-foot number because, these things tend to perpetuate and kind of drive our thinking. I think what we saw, and I'll ask staff or Tess to correct me, was one of the scenarios in a range of scenarios. And the heat map that was shown on that slide has to do with, on that continuum, here's an example. I don't think Brown and Caldwell is predicting or asserting a 7-foot sea level rise, but rather it's all in the approach of looking at everything in continuums and ranges, right? And so the idea is to be sure to assess probabilities. And so that's what we were looking at.
That was their medium level of risk. There's even a lower and greater levels, but that was the medium. So it's extraordinary. That is generally the planning criteria when you take the medium. Thank you.
All right. Well, that is what we have for item 4 in our agenda this evening. Item 5 is general manager's reports. And as you know, I love to talk, but I have nothing to share under general manager's reports this evening. And I did check with staff and they don't have anything to share either. So we can go to item 6. Item 6 is director's comments and or
Okay,
agenda
yeah.
item request.
Director's comments and or agenda item request. Anderson, any comments? I will note that I will report later on, it goes on the agenda, but had the fortune with our engineering manager, Dr. Awoke, to attend the AWWA Cal Nevada session this last week, where there was a particular emphasis on emerging water quality issues, PFAS, and now going into microplastics. And now that ironically may well become the driver. Water supply, it's the black swans that are going to turn the industry on its head and hopefully we may have to readjust and rethink many of the water strategies we're getting involved with, particularly related to recycled water. There's indications that you have the de novo creation of a hazardous substance, both in water treatment, but particularly in wastewater treatment. Thank you.
Okay.
So, great. Next is closed session. Go into closed session to discuss items pursuant to Government Code Section 54956.9, subsection D, subsection 4, a conference with legal counsel, anticipated litigation, initiation of litigation, one potential case. Thank you.
All right, very good. It's 6:02 on my clock. We will
I'll have the attorney describe what occurred during closed session.
That would be great, President Ween. Thank you for allowing me to do that. The board convened in closed session pursuant to California Government Code Section 54956.9 subsection D4. Conference with legal counsel, anticipated litigation, initiation of litigation, one potential case. And in the closed session, no action was taken, and that concludes the report.
Thank you. Is there any other item before the board this evening? We have a motion to adjourn? We are adjourned. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much.